December 1937. The air in Nanjing, then the capital of China, crackled with fear. The Imperial Japanese Army, driven by militaristic ambition and fueled by propaganda, was at China's doorstep. Weeks earlier, they had captured Shanghai after a brutal battle, leaving behind a trail of destruction and death. Now, they set their sights on Nanjing, a city steeped in history and culture, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The defense of Nanjing was disorganized and weak. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese nationalist government, had already withdrawn his best troops. He left behind a smaller, poorly equipped force to defend the city. The outcome seemed inevitable. The Japanese army, confident and ruthless, easily broke through the Chinese lines. Panic gripped Nanjing. Civilians desperate to escape the coming storm crowded the roads leading out of the city. Thousands, however, were trapped, either unwilling to leave their homes or unable to find a way out. Little did they know their hope for safety within the city walls was a cruel illusion. The fall of Nanjing on December 13, 1937, marked not the end of the battle, but the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare. The fall of Nanjing was swift and brutal, a cataclysmic event that would mark the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Japanese soldiers, emboldened by their victory and driven by a perverse sense of superiority, entered the city in a frenzy of violence. Their confidence was bolstered by the rapid collapse of Chinese defenses. They met little organized resistance. The Chinese forces, already weakened and demoralized, could not mount a significant defense. The Chinese soldiers who remained were quickly overwhelmed or had discarded their uniforms, hoping to disappear into the terrified populace. The chaos and fear were palpable as soldiers and civilians alike sought any means of escape. The Japanese, however, were in no mood for restraint. Their actions were driven by a brutal code of conduct that showed no mercy. Their orders were ambiguous, open to interpretation by commanders on the ground. This ambiguity allowed for a wide range of atrocities to be committed without fear of reprisal. What followed was a descent into barbarity, a period of 6 weeks that would forever stain the annals of history. The scale and intensity of the violence were unprecedented. The first victims were often Chinese soldiers captured during the battle or found hiding among the civilians. They were shown no mercy. Ignoring the rules of war, we executed our prisoners with cold-blooded efficiency. The riverbanks became execution grounds, stained with the blood of countless victims. Thousands were lined up along the banks of the Yangtze River and mowed down by machine guns. The relentless gunfire echoed through the city, a grim reminder of the horrors unfolding. Others were doused with gasoline and burned alive, their screams echoing through the streets of what was once a vibrant city. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and the cries of the dying. This wanton cruelty was not merely a consequence of war, it was a deliberate act of terror, intended to break the spirit of the Chinese people. The devastation was both physical and psychological. The violence, however, was not confined to combatants. Civilians bore the brunt of the Japanese army's wrath. The Japanese army, fueled by a toxic mix of nationalism, racism, and a sense of impunity, turned their aggression on civilians. The lines between soldier and civilian blurred in the chaos. Men, women, and children became fair game in a twisted game of death and domination. The streets ran red with the blood of innocents. The international safety zone, established by a handful of courageous Westerners in an attempt to provide refuge, was overrun. Even this sanctuary could not withstand the tide of violence. The rules of war, of human decency, were cast aside as Nanjing descended into an abyss of unimaginable horror. The city, once a symbol of culture and history, was reduced to a hellscape of suffering and death. The following weeks were a blur of unspeakable brutality, a dark chapter in human history that would leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of the world. Japanese soldiers, acting with impunity and driven by a twisted sense of superiority, roamed the city, committing atrocities that defied comprehension and shattered the very fabric of humanity. Homes were looted and burned, their occupants often murdered in cold blood, leaving behind a trail of devastation and sorrow. Shops were ransacked, and anything of value was taken as spoils of war, further stripping the city of its dignity and resources. The streets of Nanjing, once bustling with life and activity, became a macabre tableau of death and destruction, a haunting reminder of the fragility of peace. The air was thick with the stench of decaying corpses and the acrid smoke of burning buildings, a sensory assault that would haunt survivors for years to come. American journalist. The Japanese soldiers, desensitized by violence and driven by a perverse sense of entitlement, treated the city and its people as their personal playground, indulging in acts of unimaginable cruelty. They engaged in contests to see who could kill the most Chinese civilians, often bayoneting them to death in a grotesque display of inhumanity. Pregnant women were not spared, their bellies slashed open in a grotesque display of cruelty, a horrifying testament to the depths of human depravity. Babies were tossed into the air and caught on bayonets, their innocent laughter silenced by the cold steel, a chilling image that would forever scar the memories of those who witnessed it. The stories, documented by survivors and witnesses, paint a horrifying picture of human depravity unleashed on an unimaginable scale, a dark stain on the pages of history. The world outside Nanjing remained largely unaware of the horrors unfolding within the fallen city, a tragic consequence of the isolation and suppression of information. News of the atrocities was suppressed by the Japanese military, eager to maintain the illusion of a righteous and honorable campaign, a facade that would eventually crumble under the weight of truth. The few Western journalists who remained in Nanjing, however, bore witness to the carnage, their presence a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. Their reports, though censored by the Japanese authorities, provided glimpses of the horrors unfolding in the fallen city, a testament to the resilience of truth in the face of oppression. These accounts, smuggled out at great risk, would later serve as chilling evidence of the Japanese army's barbarity, a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that lies within humanity. The systematic sexual violence perpetrated by the Japanese army against the women of Nanjing was a particularly horrific aspect of the massacre. This brutality was not just an unfortunate byproduct of war, but a calculated and deliberate act of terror. Tens of thousands of women and girls, ranging in age from the elderly to children as young as 8, were subjected to unspeakable acts of sexual violence. The sheer number of victims highlights the scale of this atrocity, making it one of the darkest chapters in human history. Schools, hospitals, even places of worship offered no sanctuary from the marauding soldiers. These places, which should have been safe havens, were instead turned into sites of unimaginable horror and suffering. Women were dragged from their homes, often in front of their families, and subjected to gang rape. The trauma of witnessing such violence inflicted upon loved ones left deep psychological scars on entire families and communities. Many of these women were murdered after being violated, their bodies discarded in alleys or dumped into the Yangtze River. The river, once a symbol of life and sustenance, became a graveyard for countless victims. Others were left physically and emotionally scarred, their lives forever altered by the trauma they had endured. The psychological impact of such violence is profound, affecting not just the survivors but also future generations.
The stories of these women, often silenced by shame and fear, stand as a testament to the depravity of the Japanese soldiers and the enduring impact of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Their courage in eventually sharing their experiences helps to shed light on this dark period and ensures that such atrocities are not forgotten.
The systematic nature of these attacks, the sheer scale of the violence, suggests that this was not simply a case of soldiers acting on their own accord. It points to a coordinated effort, likely sanctioned by higher authorities, to use sexual violence as a means of warfare. It appears to have been, at least in part, a deliberate strategy of terror, intended to humiliate and demoralize the Chinese population. This tactic aimed to break the spirit of the people, making resistance seem futile. The silence surrounding this aspect of the Nanjing Massacre for many years after the war further compounds the trauma endured by the victims and reflects a broader societal tendency to ignore and downplay sexual violence. Acknowledging and addressing these atrocities is crucial for healing and ensuring that history does not repeat itself. The Nanjing Massacre, though orchestrated by the Japanese military, played out in countless individual acts of cruelty and resilience. Personal stories from survivors bring the horrors of that time into sharp focus.
One such story is that of Li Shuhua, a young girl at the time who witnessed her entire family, her parents, grandparents, and siblings, brutally murdered by Japanese soldiers. She herself only survived by hiding under a pile of corpses, the memory of that day forever seared into her young mind.
Another account tells of Dr. Robert Wilson, an American surgeon who stayed behind in Nanjing at great personal risk. He worked tirelessly at the makeshift hospital within the international safety zone, tending to the endless stream of wounded and dying. His diaries, smuggled out of the city, provide a harrowing first-hand account of the massacre and the courage of those who resisted the Japanese reign of terror.
These stories, though difficult to hear, are essential. They remind us that behind the staggering statistics, the historical narratives, lie individual lives shattered by war and violence. They force us to confront the human cost of conflict, the enduring legacy of trauma, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty.